Did you know there are no late fines on overdue materials at QPL? We want to make sure everyone can use the library's resources, no matter their circumstances. For more details on QPL's elimination of late fines, visit queenslib.org/goodbye late fines. School is in session and we have free help for homework. BrainFuse Help now offers homework help, online tutoring, and more school support for kids in grades K-12 daily from 2 to 11 p.m. A library card and Wi-Fi connection are all that your child needs in order to participate. Visit queenslib.org/brainfuse to get started. The next election takes place on November 8th, and early voting starts on October 29th. Visit our blog for more important dates, voting FAQs, voting plans, and voter resources.
Welcome to Wellness Wednesdays. I'm Christopher Galarza, Queens Public Library's Community Health Educator. Today, we welcome back Cherise Francis for a monthly workshop series, where we will read and discuss excerpts from essays and generate written work based on prompts inspired by the memoir anthology, You Are Your Best Thing, Vulnerability, Shame, Resilience, and the Black Experience, edited by Tarana Burke and Brene Brown. Based on the quotation from Toni Morrison's Beloved, how can we see ourselves as our own best thing? How does living in our truth give us the breathing room to be our full selves? We will be deep diving into various themes like vulnerability, family, healing, spirituality, social and institutional oppressions, art, and memory. And without further ado, please welcome Cherise Francis.
Thank you, Christopher. And welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be reading from Kizé Lehman's essay as well as Prentice Hemphill's essay. We're going to be discussing how the importance of recognizing lived bodily experiences and lived mental experiences are important in health and healthcare. But first, I want us to listen to a reading from Sonia Renee Taylor and her work in The Body Is Not an Apology. Whoops. Oh, wait. For some reason it's not playing. Okay. So I'm not sure why I can't click on it, but I do advise you all to go listen to Sonia Renee Taylor's The Body Is Not an Apology. A lot of her work is about exploring bodily shame and removing that shame so we can be our full selves. And I think her work relates a lot to what we're going to be talking about today in terms of recognizing the shame we internalize and removing that so we can actually live healthier lives for ourselves. So stepping into that, we will start reading from Kizé Lehman's essay, My Head is a Part of My Body and Other Notes on Crazy. I do not want to be killed by a white doctor in America. I think I will be killed by a white doctor in America. That's crazy, right? As a child, the word crazy bounced around every Black space I called home. Crazy was a destination, an origin, pejorative, and wholly emblematic of our abundance. I love the word crazy. I used it a lot in my oral communication with folks I loved and folks I despise. When we said crazy in my Mississippi village, it had either 1.5 syllables or 3 syllables. There was no way to actually spell the 1.5 syllable version. It wasn't at all cray. It was more crazy if the hyphen was extremely faint and truncated, and the long A was sliced in half where it almost looked like a sick C barely sticking out its tongue. That's crazy. The 3.0 version reserved for extremely crazy stuff was crazy, like when Grandmama and her husband Lester Myers both went into diabetic comas after Christmas dinner, and white people, these young EMTs from Forest, Mississippi, first stepped foot in my grandmother's house. The craziest part of it was how all of grandmama's children and grandchildren, all laced with graduate degrees, started over enunciating words when those working class young white folks came in the house. We assumed that those white folks, the first to ever step foot in that house, had the power to save or kill my grandmother and her husband. They were both extremely vulnerable, and our history with white folks and our history with white folks in hospitals let us know that these white folks could eat our elders and their vulnerabilities if they wanted to without consequence. We hoped not, though. Our proper English would save them. That's crazy. I want to use the word crazy in more of my writing. Instead, I use the language of health, healing, mental illness, and reckoning. Rarely do I admit that I am indeed horrified of hospitals and terrified of white doctors. Some of this has to do with the fact that I've always been treated like a poor big black man, even when I was a poor young black boy by white people. I never had a tender medical experience in my life. Instead of going to doctors who I assume treat me like the N-word, I avoided them until the blood in my body hissed. While we Black men must embrace tenderness and critically engage with our vulnerability, I also think it's crazy how often that vulnerability is gobbled up along with the rest of our bodies by the worst of white folks. That's crazy. I spent every day of my middle-aged life avoiding light, working and eating in bed, never eating in front of people, not answering the phone when family calls, not answering the door when friends come by, abstaining from that which brings me joy, expecting to die tomorrow, and hiding from people I know when I go out in public. This sounds crazy to me. When I was around people at the strangest time, I'd get this fuzzy feeling in my head and heart as if I were about to stop breathing. When a friend found me balled up on a wooden bench at work, they took me directly to the emergency room. The emergency room was packed, and I convinced my friend that I would call a doctor and make an appointment as soon as possible if they would let me go home and just lie down. 3 weeks later, when I had another experience of nearly passing out in my classroom, I went to the doctor. I used one strange James Baldwin, Nina Simone accents. I tucked my shirt in. I didn't wear sneakers. The doctor, a happy go lucky white man in his late 30s, checked my vitals. He checked my blood. He checked my heart. Initially, he said that they needed to send me to the emergency room because something on tests didn't look right. He ran the tests again. Oh, it's fine, he said. We just need to schedule an appointment with a cardiologist to see why you keep feeling like you're going to faint. I thought that was a win. That's crazy. I went to the cardiologist the next day. I greeted him as only Baldwin or Simone could. I wore the closest thing I had to penny loafers. I ironed my outfit for the first time in a decade. The doctor strapped a monitor to my chest to track my heart rate. For the next week, at the end of the week, the doctor said there was a slight murmur, but everything with my heart was fine. The following day, I kept feeling as though I was going to die. I kept avoiding people, kept swimming in the shame of professional, romantic, economic, and health failure. I Googled heart attack, heart disease, and chronic anxiety. It took 2 minutes on Google for me to understand that I had been having panic attacks. I couldn't understand why the doctors looked at my tucked in shirts heard my fake accent and still refused to do anything other than treat me like an N-word. That's crazy. My problem, I guess, is that I don't think being crazy should stop us from being compassionate and actively regretful about structural or interpersonal harm we've caused. My friends who have been diagnosed as doctor crazy said it's Black crazy to think like this. I say that I don't think we've really considered whose doctor crazy shields them from consequence and whose Black crazy is fuel for disciplining and humiliation. The only time I've been encouraged by a white doctor to tend to my mental health was when a white institution thought I was crazy for not wanting a school where I paid tuition to treat me like an N-word. That's crazy. And then Kize talks more about his experience with institutional schooling. And I'm going to forward down to this section. It wasn't until I talked with Dr. Imani Walker about a project that had nothing to do with my crazy that I understood some of what was happening to my body, my head, and my relationship with crazy. In college and today, Dr. Imani did more than give me the language of depression and anxiety and chronic fatigue and disordered eating. She told me that everything I thought was wrong with me was everything the nation engineered to ail Black folk in this country. My first question to Dr. Imani was, "What's crazy?" After my conversation with Dr. Imani, like a lot of my friends who regularly go to therapy, I started talking that therapy talk. I beat myself up for not believing my experience with Black doctors could be any different from my experience with white doctors. I used words like sourcing and sublimate in conversations that had little to do with misdirected sourcing or sublimation. That lasted a week. That's crazy. Part of my crazy compels me to imagine and really obsess over the radical possibilities of art. In the last few weeks of summer, though, the radical imagining necessitated commemorating radical realities I've yet to accept. I am a writer. I'm a Black man. I am crazy. Actually, I am the child of two equally crazy kids from rural Mississippi. My crazy ass mama lives alone on the East Coast. My crazy ass father lives alone on the West Coast. My crazy ass lives alone in Mississippi. That's crazy. And he talks a little bit more about his family and his hip problems and getting help for that. But in thinking about what Kize has written here, some people may think it's an irrational fear for him to be afraid of white doctors or white people who work in the medical field. But I want to highlight Kize sharing his experiences of as the importance of recognizing lived body experiences, especially lived body experiences of Black people who often deal with institutional racism. So you may ask, what is institutional racism? So institutional racism, and this is my definition, are social fears, negative perceptions, and implicit biases that are thought of people classified as other, and this affects their treatment in institutional spaces. Another one comes from Tom Head from the definition of institutional racism, the history and implicit and implications of institutional the history and implications of institutional racism from Thought.co. And the term institutional racism, which was coined by Stokely Carmichael, who would later become known as Kwame Ture, describes societal patterns and structures that impose oppressive or otherwise negative conditions on identifiable groups on the basis of race or ethnicity. Oppression may come from business, the government, the healthcare system, the schools, or the court, among other institutions. This phenomenon may also be referred to as societal racism, institutionalized racism, or cultural racism. And institutional racism ends up affecting Black people and other people of color in achieving healthy lifestyles and receiving the appropriate health care that they need. mainly because misconceptions and assumptions based on race and ethnicity ends up influencing how medical professionals treat Black people and people of color, as we read with Kize Lemon and his experiences with medical institutions. So, in thinking about medical racism and health equity, um, I read from the WYCA about what is medical racism, and they talked about how racism is both our society and how racism causes stress upon Black people and people of color, and that causes us to have less healthier outcomes. But it's also the disparity in health coverage and access to proper health care and the biases held by a largely white healthcare workforce. And experiences like overt and covert racism causes higher levels of stress and hypertension and things like toxic stress, which is stress that is way above normal stress, everyday stress. And economic factors like poverty, including houselessness, homelessness, and unsafe housing, often leads to less access to healthcare and health insurance coverage. If you don't have a stable address, it can be harder to get access to healthcare that you need. And also racist treatment from healthcare workers. For example, there has been scientific racism that has occurred throughout the history of this country, where oftentimes Black people are assumed to feel less pain and need less treatment than other races, and Black people often have to suffer in worse ways because they're not receiving the proper treatment that they need. And this also applies to intersectionality. For example, a Black person who's also a woman or a member of the LGBTQ community will also have increased difficulty accessing proper health care, such as reproductive health and the increased birthing mortality rates with Black birthing people. So, one popular example was Serena Williams when she was experiencing blood clots after birth, and the doctors basically ignored her until her white husband came in, and then they decided to help her with her blood clots. Other intersectional issues are environmental racism. So, because Black people tend to live in poor neighborhoods, they're more likely to be in high polluting neighborhoods near factories and other places where pollution tends to be dumped in those areas. And that also affects health conditions of Black people where they develop more asthma and other kinds of illnesses. And then there's also racism in technology, where because of implicit biases in the creation of um, the technology is not properly measuring things like, for example, modern spirometers that are used to measure lung capacity during the past 2 years were the software was assuming that Black people had 20% less lung capacity than whites, which was an untrue theory invented during slavery. So a lot of these different uh, ways that institutional and medical racism can show up and affect the health of Black people and people of color in general. So, just to recap, social and environmental issues like microaggressions and other stressors and poverty affect the health of Black people and people of color. Reproductive justice is an important part in thinking about institutional and medical racism, lack of medical and therapy access and coverage because of expense, the expensiveness of healthcare, as well as the lack of access in general because of the underrepresentation of Black and POC doctors and medical practitioners. For example, there's a video in the resources I'll share later that talked about that the increase in Black and POC doctors usually cuts in half the mortality rate of Black birthing people. There's also racial biases for symptoms and medication, as well as thinking about how Black people and POC have to endure harsher treatment when it comes to healthcare. And of course, medical tools and technologies that are biased against Black bodies. And then the last thing, which is what Kizé Lemon mentions in his essay, respectability politics. This is when marginalized groups have to portray themselves in a dominant, socially acceptable way to receive proper treatment, which adds on to stress and anxiety. This can be seen as a form of hypervigilant behavior, according to Hedwig Lee and Margaret Takao Hicken. And that added on stress of having to portray oneself in a certain way in hopes that you will get better treatment is similar to the word I mentioned in the first workshop about masking, and how masking is not a healthy practice to do. It adds on stress and anxiety to the person who has to mask. And so respectability politics, in a way, is a form of masking. Now, in his essay, Kizé Lemon also talks about crazy and how, being Black, he has a different cultural understanding of crazy. And essentially, he's alluding to how crazy has been used in a political way to often cause further harm to marginalized communities like Black communities. And there's this quote from Maria Kohut in Racism in Mental Health Care: An Invisible Barrier. There are serious, unconscionable disparities in access to mental health for people of color in America, says Nathan Green, one of MNT's expert advisors. African Americans, Latinx, and Asian Americans receive treatment of mental health challenges at 50 to 70% lower rates than white Americans in this country. Found that Black individuals reported mistrust in mental health services systems due to the experiences of racism. Sorry. Black respondents, particularly those who had been through higher education, reported that they had experienced stigmatization and that professionals had minimized their mental health symptoms. This resulted in a lack of access to appropriate care. And this goes back to what I mentioned before about medical racism, where medical practitioners are believe that Black people have less pain, and so that affects the treatment that Black people receive. And the same goes for mental health, where if a therapist doesn't believe your lived experiences of being Black in America, dealing with microaggressions, dealing with racism, that will compound the trauma that you already go through as a Black person if you're not being believed for your experiences that you have to go through on a daily basis. And in thinking about that, um, it also reminded me of in the 1960s, terms like crazy, madness, and this still continues today, terms like crazy, madness, and other mental health terminology were used to further oppress, harm, and stigmatize Black people and other marginalized groups. So, for example, during the civil rights era in the 60s and the 70s, um, schizophrenia, the diagnosis, was often used against Black men who were seen as being violent, and if they were protesting in the civil rights movement, the schizophrenia diagnosis was often used to kind of suppress uh, protests and resistance to social oppressions. So, in thinking about the social politics of crazy and how often marginalized people like Black communities often have to deal with shaming around their bodies and their bodies' lived experiences, I want to read this last section from Layman's essay and how he tries to deal with. The oppression he has to deal with when in the medical institutional spaces. Over this pandemic, I've been doing something called Ode and Apology. I started writing odes and apologies to folks I've disrespected and harmed. That was tough, brutal, but it was nowhere near as hard as writing odes and apologies to body parts I've mangled through neglect. So far, I've written to both hips, my eyelashes, the folds in my neck, my wrists, the right side of my groin, my molars, the mole on my left ass cheek, the base of my penis, and the back of both thighs. The hardest ode and apology was written to my head, my brain, because I seldom think of my head or my brain as part of my body. My head, too big to naturally come out of my mama, has helped me fly underneath the dirt of Mississippi. It's helped me float when my heart has been waterlogged. When my head has begged for help, I thought I was giving it help in the form of rigorous routines of writing and reading. Our relationship is asymmetrical. My head bails me out. I punish it for bailing me out. It punishes me for punishing it, and I tell it to shut up because we're trying to work. I actually don't know if I'm doctor crazy, but I know my head needs help. My head needs help when I was in college. My head needs help now. I know that any love I purport to have for any human in this world is not nearly as radical or tender as it can be as long as I fail to give my head help. It's crazy what this nation does to our head. It's crazier that many of us who have the means still think our heads are undeserving of help. I know our heads are worth risking humiliation so we can breathe. I know that continual humiliation in this nation leads to death. I do not want to be killed by a white doctor in America. I think I will be killed by a white doctor in America. That's crazy. If I write it one more time, I might actually believe it. That's crazy, right? So what I liked about Kize Lemon's ending of the essay is him acknowledging how his body has supported him through um, the daily struggle of trying to live in America, basically. And he writes odes to praise his body for continuing to support him despite that struggle, and also apologizing to his body for the way that he's treated it, the way he's neglected it, apologizing for what his body has had to endure in terms of medical racism and institutional oppression. And so, in thinking about that, I want you all to do the same, to write an ode or a song of praise to celebrate your body in keeping you alive despite whatever conditions you live in, and or an apology for your body and the mistreatment, shaming it receives. And I'll give you a few minutes to begin writing that. Okay, I hope you were able to write something based off of that prompt. Now we're going to continue talking about the body processing trauma, especially traumas from institutional oppressions and medical oppressions as well. And so we're going to read from Prentice Hemphill's The Wisdom of Process and thinking further about different practices we can do for tending to our own bodies, especially when we have problems accessing care from institutions. I am a Black Southerner, Texas born with Louisiana roots. I come from people who have survived some of the worst and don't make a practice of looking back. We have moved through always with our culture, with our joy, and we were taught that you move through because you have to. It's what we've always done, sometimes even to the neglect of our healing. Trauma then was also not what we called the things that happened between us when the pressure and powerlessness exploded into intimate violence. Those were secrets and things we endured. We found hiding places in our bodies for all these memories because no one I knew had the time or resources to heal. On Sundays, we took those places to church and prayed that we could be delivered from them somehow without naming them or feeling them or looking them squarely in the face. They were too big or too many or too close. I grew up in a household that could as easily erupt in laughter and hugs and teasing as it could in violence. It's not easy to say this, even now. I know that my parents tried to love with the limited examples and the lingering trauma that they each had. As a child, you never knew which way the wind would blow, though. You knew that jobs were lost or never looked for, or that lights were turned off, or that checks bounced. But you never knew when those experiences combined with a lifetime of pain would come for you over a small thing. Growing up, we were told that our business had to stay in the family home. In Black families, this is not only a matter of decorum, it is a rule about safety. Safety that is contingent on you being less yourself, and therefore it is also about shame. It is necessary for your safety that you know what this world finds dangerous about you. Brene Brown has defined shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. It is the fear that something we've done or failed to do makes us unworthy of connection. This is the emotional weight that many of us carry. Shame is also the way that oppression becomes internalized. It is an emotional ritual for the marginalized. It is a practice necessary to maintain our already conditional belonging here. We feel shame about the aspects of our lives that are most fundamental to who we are, that are tied not only to our actions, but to our essence. Our Blackness, our genders, our queerness, and all things that accompany them, our skin tones, our shapes, our hair textures, our cadences, our desires. And we feel shame about the secrets we hold, many that we hold to keep us together. For me, this meant that one of my first lessons was how to keep people a distance away. In some ways, this was easy. My family decided to send me out of my community to a school that was predominantly white across town. It was one of the most profound shapings for me around shame as a requirement of belonging. It was a lesson in pretending that I knew the New Kids on the Block songs they sang when I listened to New Edition, pretending that I lived near them and shopped at the same stores, pretending that the comments and the names didn't hurt when they did, pretending that my home was a steady place. Growing up, I only ever invited one friend over to spend the night. She was one of the 4 other Black children in my 5th grade class, but unlike me, her family had enough money to live where white people did. Their lawn was always mowed and their house did not have roaches. The Saturday she was supposed to come over, I spent the morning killing every roach I could find, thinking it was possible to kill enough to be accepted. When she arrived, I planned to walk into every room loudly, offering any surviving roaches the time to scatter. When she came, I showed her around the house doing my best impersonation of a real kid who is not ashamed or afraid. As soon as I turned the lights on in my room, a roach on cue casually flew across the room. It sank me. I launched into a story about the differences between water bugs and cockroaches before letting shame and silence swallow me. She never said anything about it then or later, but I remember lying awake that night with tears biting my lip to stay quiet. This is why you don't let people over. This is why you don't let them in. When when I got to be a teenager, my sexuality and gender expression refused to iron out into something more respectable. The tomboyishness that my grandmother identified in me only matured into a queerness that refused binaries and easy categorization. My sense of belonging became even more unstable. For months, I prayed at night that I would wake up change, interested in different things with different desires. When I kept waking up as myself, I started praying that I wouldn't wake up at all. When my family finally found out I was queer, it was devastating. It wasn't that they hadn't suspected, it was that in being told, they felt that I had chosen my identity over them. I had forced them to carry shame for my unruliness, and in their rejection of me, I could sense all the things about themselves they believed to have hidden or compromised in order to belong, and the expectation that I could or would do the same. To insist that belonging shaped around me and received me as I am was a paradigm shift that seemed too dangerous for a world where all of our belonging was tenuous. So for a period, I was expelled. I left home, moved across the country where there was less contact and what felt like less love. I took with me a mountain of shame that would sometimes be, become defiance, but always at its root, a longing to return. As an adult, the shame I experienced around the trauma of poverty and abuse made it almost impossible to allow and maintain intimacy. Always lurking was the fear that I would be found out, that if I invited someone over and turned the lights on, somebody would fly out, namely who I really was. I hadn't, though I longed to experience the sense that I could belong as I am, with my story and with my experience. So it's important to name this task of healing sits against a political backdrop. That that backdrop doesn't allow us to simply individualize healing or imagine that it could ever be an apolitical endeavor. For Black people, many of the tools and technologies used by our ancestors to heal has been taken or suppressed. And the extent of the traumas we have experienced has been constant and collective, overwhelming our efforts and our resources to address. In many ways, the moment in which we find ourselves is calling for each and all of us to acknowledge and address the existence of Black pain and trauma, and finally and with consequence. Each death and each riot activates another memory of another life lost without justice or reason. This is how trauma unhealed haunts and accumulates, reemerging and reanimating the body. It does not disappear. The study of trauma has been itself a way to name human pain that lingers and lives on after rupture, especially in the individual, but increasingly also in the collective. We understand more now about how trauma winds and warps inhabiting bodies, permeating relationships, and shaping lineages. This country has made a practice of denying the existence of trauma in Black bodies and communities, and also denying its own role ultimately in traumatizing us. We've also denied and ignored it. Our pain has not been a consideration that many of us can afford to feel. So we cope and adapt and make private rituals to honor who has been lost and what of us is lost in their leaving. I'll stop there and talk about shame and processing trauma and systems of care. Prentice Hemphill talks about in their essay, The Wisdom of Process, how um, because of social oppressions and institutional oppressions, often marginalized people are forced to um, to deny the ways that they've been traumatized in order to continue surviving within the society. And that denial of support and resources for trauma and the denial of the trauma in general often compounds the trauma as well. And that constant internalizing of trauma of these institutional and social oppressions leads to shame, as Prentice mentions in their essay, and shame around seeking help because you expect that no help will be given to you. So you just hold it in within yourself. So, in thinking about Prentice Hemphill's essay, how can we learn how to acknowledge and process the true roots and sources of our pain, especially because we live in a society that tells us to suppress pain a lot and to just cover up pain instead of engaging pain as a kind of guide to actually true healing. And so this goes to what Prentice talked about in terms of the politics of healing, that healing is not just personal, but it's systematic. It's not just a personal feeling of pain, but how the treatment of our bodies in our society affects us and traumatizes us, whether that is race, whether that is sexism, whether that is homophobia and transphobia, whether that is fat phobia, how the shaming of our bodies and the politicizing of that shaming of our bodies prevents us from truly healing from our trauma. So, in thinking about how do we continue to process trauma that is stored in our body, um, thinking about three different things that we can do is cultivating spaces for healing. How do we create spaces for ourselves that helps us to acknowledge the pain that we dealt with and creates a safe space for us to acknowledge those pains and thinking about how um, certain spaces compound trauma, especially when they continue to deny the pain and lived experiences that you deal with. How do you create spaces, especially with community, that helps you to explore and process the trauma and pain that you regularly have to deal with? Um, Another is thinking about health equity. How do we distribute wellness resources? Often, when we think of wellness, we think that everyone has the same access to wellness and healthcare resources, but oftentimes these resources are for only the privileged few. I've heard, for example, on social media, how people will tell you, "Oh, just go to therapy," and they don't think of all of the barriers that can prevent someone from going to therapy. Therapy is expensive often. Um, Also, if you're from a marginalized community, the therapist you get may not be able to relate to you and what you personally experience in relation to your own identity. And so they may say things that increases the trauma and pain that you have to deal with because they're not acknowledging the personal experiences that you have to go through if you're, for example, Black, or you're a member of the LGBTQ community, or you're a woman, or any other identity. They may have implicit biases that prevent them from actually being able to help you in a way that actually does service to you. And that goes to also cultural, social, and environmental centered somatic practices. And one of the resources I'll mention later talks about the importance of having somatic practices. And somatics has to do with um, ag- acknowledging the feelings that your body experiences and how to properly and healthily engage those feelings your body feels. And the importance of having cultural, social, and environmental centered practices that incorporate all the lived experiences that you actually go through to help remove a lot of the shaming of your body in general. So in thinking about those three, like to continue reading a little bit from Prentice Hemphill's work, and then we'll end with a prompt. So denial, though, is always a temporary fix. Each experience is still waiting to be felt, honored, and understood. Waiting is the undeniable impulse the body has toward healing. Healing this generational trauma requires an end to what continues to traumatize us: police violence, the violence of generational and systematic poverty. It also requires our commitment to the feeling, to the ritual, to the process that will make us anew. On the other side of healing is not a return to what has been, but instead renewed purpose, deeper relationships, and dignity for the collective. Like many others, I came to political work with an unspoken and unconscious motivation to create and experience belonging. I had trained as a therapist and somatics practitioner and spent some years counseling in my community before I came into Black Lives Matter Global Network as the Healing Justice Director and then later as a politicized somatics teacher. In everything I've done, I've wanted to create spaces where poor people, queer and trans people, Black and brown people, and formerly incarcerated people could heal without being re traumatized in the process. I had been in too many therapeutic rooms myself that were unsafe, where I had to keep things hidden so as not to be pathologized or blamed in the way that it is our habit to blame bodies like mine. I wanted a space, however small, for my community to look across the room and not have to hide. I had been working to create a world that would know how to embrace a child like me, one that would make room for my family to heal. It hasn't always been as clear to me how personal it was, how much of my work was a working through of my pain. But healing our lineages is also healing our lives. That we parse healing and politics apart is some of what plagues us. To understand uprisings or to understand protests, you have to understand emotional repression. You have to understand that there are feelings that we have not allowed. Rage forms when grief has not been allowed or honored. What I've what I've experienced in these streets is the convergence and expression of grief that spans generations, grief that has been silenced and unacknowledged but lives on in us. This is also for so many of us the practice of healing shame, of moving beyond the frame of respectability that we have been told keeps us safe but doesn't. What are our politics if not the method through which we create and distribute wellness with what we have? What is culture if not our practice of resilience? And I'm gonna skip a little bit. Healing brought me into a face to face confrontation with belonging, with the strategies I had developed to hide the stories I told about not needing anyone that made the hiding easier. Healing had me admit that it was closeness. I wanted love and relationship and family who didn't ask me to hide. Healing trauma in individuals has never been an easy task. In doing it, we are in fact moving to the body's edge and through the waves of memory and impulses designed to protect our lives. We are revisiting the compromises the body has made to safety, belonging, or dignity in order to survive. And we are finding another path internally where these can be restored, bringing us back into connection, feeling, and community. Black trauma is a concentration of generations of these experiences that overwhelm not only the individual but the community, enforced and enacted through policies that have displaced us and criminalized our cultural practices that helped us heal. It is also the trauma of a systematic denial of resources or stability needed to address the pain and aftershocks of massive collective trauma and daily assaults and indignities. We have survived through a persistent commitment to life by filling simple lives with big love and a commitment to injustice. And the truth of the matter is that the need for healing does not disappear because we have found a way to survive. This work of healing waits for us in moments of stillness or intimacy, in the persistence of doubt or shame in our struggles to find or sustain stories of meaning or risk living into our purpose. The dissonances we can feel the dissonances we can feel are all the breaks we survive, waiting to be unraveled through feeling, waiting ultimately to free us and our lineage. Our pain aversion makes this question of healing challenging to approach. It is one of the central motivators in American culture to win our way to pain free existence. This does not mean that we do not experience pain. All of us do. but it means that we hide it, we deny it, and we transfer it as custom. It means that we shape the world to outsource suffering, that we create structures to concentrate this pain and mythologies of superiority to justify it. These are the mechanics of oppression. It is the organization and distribution of trauma across a society. Those with more power can choose more of their pain. But pain serves a role in a life. When experienced at a digestible rate, when our belonging and safety are not at risk, it can develop us. It can sturdy our sense of ourselves and open up the capacity for empathy. It can remind us that much of what there is to feel can be felt in our bodies or with support from our relations. And yet, pain, disproportionately felt without space for respite or relief, without accountability or acknowledgement, creates a thing that festers. And I'm going to stop there before we run out of time. But I wanted to share this model from University of Minnesota School of Public Health. That's a mental health and well-being, a socio-ecological model, and I want you to take a look at it. It's a map that is the individual, relationships, organizations, communities, and policy and society. And I want you to look at it and reflect on um, what are some of the pains and traumas that you experience in each of these fields, and to help you address um, the trauma and pains that you go through, whether it's individual, whether it's in your interpersonal relationships with others, whether it's in institutional organizations, or even the communities that you're a part of, what institutional policies harm you as well, and how does society overall cause you trauma and harm as well. And in acknowledging those different traumas and pains, what are some steps that you can take to try to chip away at those things as well? So I'm going to share some takeaway prompts for to help further processing trauma that is stored in your body. Nervous system regulation, as I mentioned the map just now, creating a map of how you process the trauma. Um, what pains in your body do you need to listen to and acknowledge? Because pains are body signals and messaging for your body. Where do you hold trauma in your body? For example, where does your body feel the most tense? So, for example, for me, I hold pain in my shoulder and tension in my shoulders and in my hands and feet a lot. So, I've been doing a lot of stretching exercises to kind of release that stored energy in my body. And you can do so as well if you have other areas of your body where you store trauma. I know a lot of people also store trauma in their core section, in their hips and their waist. So doing exercises to help release the energy in those areas as well can help. And last, what cravings does your body desire? What does those cravings say about the type of nourishment your body needs or the way your body needs to open up? Oftentimes, our society tells you to deny the needs that your body has, but acknowledging those cravings and desires that your bodies has is a step towards actually proper health and healing for you. And to end, I just want to share some resources. I mentioned before, The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor. The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma by Bessel van der Kolk is a great book. Resmaa Menakem's Cultural Somatic Work, Somatic Abolitionism is also a great resource. There's a reading list for racism and health, racial discrimination in the healthcare, how structural racism affects healthcare. And last, Is PragerU Right About Diversity in STEM by Dr. Fatima, and she talks a little bit more about medical and institutional racism in that video as well. And before we close, I just want to acknowledge some of the comments. Melissa McLean said, yes, as a poor Southern Black woman, first generation student attending a PWI. I thought being a poor Southern Black woman was a head knocker. Not until recently have I acknowledged the trauma. Yes. Oftentimes we're made to feel guilty, whether because of our race, because of our social class, or any other identity markers, when that's not something we should be ashamed of, because it's not our fault the way society treats us. Um,
Yeah, definitely. And Charisse, I think the larger thing that we're talking about, social determinants of health, right?
mhm,
There's things that are going on that affect our health, that it's not just us or our own beings. It's really things that we can intervene on, either on the first, second, or third level, as we say. But thank you so much, Charisse. Our time is over, but thank you so much,
mhm.
and thank you everyone for joining. We hope that we see you next time, and if you'd like to follow along in the selections that Charisse has been choosing, please go to your local library or online to our Queens Public Library so you can borrow your best thing. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.